Welcome to Workforce Central, the official podcast of the National Association of Workforce Boards. Stay tuned as we explore the latest resources, thoughts, and trends in workforce development. And now, here's your host, Ron Painter.
Welcome to another edition of Workforce Central. I'm your host, Ron Painter. Doug Foresta, as always, dutifully at the controls. And we got another very interesting conversation coming at you today. Dr. Richard Lum, who is the CEO for Vision Foresight Strategy, LLC, is in the house with me. Richard, welcome.
Thank you very much. And thank you for having me.
And I have to say, welcome to the mainland. Richard has the tough duty of being located in Honolulu. So
it is a tough gig, but someone has to shoulder that burden.
Well, welcome way east. Richard's PhD is in political science and future studies from the University of Hawaii. His work there focused on political design and constitution making in the 21st century. Today, Richard and Vision Foresight Strategy focuses on work with clients on developing foresight, anticipating the future, and developing strategy to address that. He's also the author of a new book, 4 Steps to the Future, published by Future Scribe. And Richard, I'm happy to say to folks, if they go out and download our new app, which is available through iTunes and through Android, they're going to be able to pick up a link to the book. And I have to tell you that if you can explain this to me in a short book, and I can understand what I thought I understood most of it, then you've really done an amazing job. It's a great read and really, really got me thinking. Tell us a little bit about how you got into this. Your degrees are in poli-sci, and how did you get into the whole futuring idea?
So, and we don't have all afternoon, so I'll try and keep this reasonably short. But futurists, you'll find, actually deal a lot with history and looking backwards. So we'll start with a little bit of history. My professor, a man named James Dater, who only recently retired from the University of Hawaii, back in the, I want to say, late 70s, he started the Futures program and at the University of Hawaii. And so when I was an undergrad and I transferred back to the University of Hawaii to complete my undergraduate in political science, Jim Dater, who was a political scientist, started the program in the poli-sci department. I was trying to complete my degree, and you need a certain amount of electives, to complete your degree. And one day, flipping through the course catalog, there was an elective course that was Design a Government on Mars. And I'm a big lover of science fiction, and I was like, oh, this will be cool. This will be easy, and this will be cool. Let's do this one for my elective. And that turned out to be the undergraduate course in futures that Jim offered. And so I took that course and it just blew my mind. And I had so much fun doing it. And he made you go out like 50, 100 years and really think very, very critically about how you would design a government on Mars. And so when I had to go to grad school, I was already hooked, and so went into the program.
And I'm not going to ask you about the quality of the government that you designed on Mars versus what we're living with. I'll take a pass on that. So you mentioned sci-fi, and I know that people are probably thinking that's what we're talking about, but that's really not what future thinking gets us, right? I mean, describe what we get when we do this.
Absolutely. So I would always sort of say futures thinking, we use that phrase a lot. Futures thinking, you can really think of as, it just means critical thinking about the future. And so very much what we're trying to do with it is to help folks think critically about the future in terms of understanding that, yes, there are trends, but understanding that trends are not everything. Looking at emerging issues, looking at the various different ways that change actually happens in the world. And often looking at history, because when we look back, history often is more tumultuous and full of change than we seem to remember. And so all of that is sort of part and parcel about thinking about good futures thinking. And so when we're able to engage in good futures thinking, it gives us a number of potential benefits. On one level, just when we do it with a group, with a client group, It's creating a shared understanding about what is possible, what is changing. Having everybody on the same page can be really, really important in an organization. So that's one positive. But it also does other things like the process and the act of future thinking. You're identifying critical blind spots that you haven't normally sort of looked at. You are very much identifying and trying to reduce the many uncertainties that are out there in the future. And on a more positive note, not just being reactive, you are using future thinking to identify those new spaces, those new opportunities that are emerging that you want to get into, that you might want to get into.
So as we sit here, this is really a most interesting time in terms of change. Not only are workforce boards now working with a new piece of legislation, the final regs are just out, but our education partners are looking at a new elementary act. They're looking at a discussion of Carl Perkins, the Career Tech Education, the Higher Education Act is up. TANF is being talked about, and on top of all of that, we got a presidential race. Those are major factors, right? If we're going to sit down and we're going to think about the future, is this a good time to be thinking about all of that, or are we already too late?
No, well, okay, so let's sort of pull back. You have, when we're looking at the future of, say, workforce, broadly speaking, there are, of course, a lot of different things to consider that are the things that are going to end up shaping what that future for the American workforce looks like. Some of those are regulatory. Many of what you mentioned are regulatory. Sometimes regulation seems to just pop, but a lot of folks will say you can often see regulatory issues coming from a little bit off. So if this is the first time a particular, say, workforce board is noticing or coming to the conversation about one of these, yes, they might be on the regulatory side, they might be a little bit behind the curve. However, regulatory is one out of several issues that are going to be very important for the future of the American workforce. And so there are many others in which it is absolutely a good time to now jump in and both become familiar with the potential changes, but also in certain cases to try and sort of position and try to understand how we can take advantage of some of those things for the particular local workforces.
You work a lot with private sector companies. Do you find more and more public side nonprofits are starting to try and think about, in the book you talk about futuring and scenario planning. Are more organizations trying to figure this out, trying to get some acumen at this?
I think, in fact, there was an article in the Wall Street Journal just, I think, the other day talking about CEOs looking for I think, new insight. I think what you have, broadly speaking, whether it's across the sectors, nonprofit, government, for-profit, I think you have many more people feeling and describing turbulence. And with that increased sort of turbulence, really describing what sounds like a growing uncertainty about what is coming next. And so across all of those sectors, I think there's a bigger interest. The other thing that you have going on is that things like scenario planning or using scenarios to think about many different possible futures. Those tools have now been around for a few short decades, and so they are starting to become part of the common language in like business or government. In fact, I had a meeting with the White House a couple of days ago, and among the topics we were talking about was scenarios and the use of scenarios across governments. And it's becoming, of course, a much more common tool and part of the toolkit that leaders use today.
In the book, I just realized I'm holding in the audience. Can't see, but trust me, I'm really doing a great job of holding the book. In the book, you talk about there's a couple of frameworks that you can think about. I'm not asking you not to go into detail, but if somebody wanted to check out some frameworks of how they could think about this, what would they be looking for?
So if we do sort of a real quick, the book lays out, the book was written for the audience is really, the internet audience is, those folks who are now either wanting to do some future thinking, some foresight work in the context of strategic planning, or are being tasked to do it and haven't had an experience with it yet. So the book is really written for sort of a beginner, a middle manager, junior vice president, those kind of folks who often end up doing this. And so the book does sort of lay out a process, a how-to, and it moves very quickly from how to look at history and how to try and extract very quickly from history some important lessons and patterns and why things have been changing. Then it moves to the present, in which it introduces things like emerging issues analysis, which is a little bit unique to future studies. And so everybody is familiar with trends. A trend is a description of change. A trend is a historical change over time, and they are important. But a trend by itself is describing history. It's not actually talking about the future. Trends often change. Futures comes at this to try and round it out by looking at emerging issues. Those are new technologies, they're new potential public policy issues, they're maybe new business models or ideas that right now might be sort of fringe or out of the mainstream, not ready for prime time. But if they continue to mature and get into the spotlight, could have a big impact. And so emerging issues analysis is, how do you identify these things and how do you bring those possibilities into the conversation? So that would be another example of something that the book uses.
You mentioned a couple of things as issues. When you're sitting down now to work with an organization, what are some of the really big uncertainties that immediately come to your mind? And maybe something, I don't know, is it something that if we sat back and thought about it, we could, as we go through mapping this, we could think about it? Or, are these things that you've come to know have more impact than maybe others?
They're some of the easy ones that are very top of mind. And I think most listeners would immediately sort of go, oh yeah, I've been seeing stuff on that. The automation issue, right?
Yeah.
The machines, the robots. And there's a good article, and I apologize because I can't think of the blog reference off the top of my head, but somebody did a really nice job recently of looking over over the 20th century in America, the rise and fall of, or the ebb and flow of the panic around the machines are going to take our jobs, right? So that mania, that sort of panic has happened several times in American history. It's not new, but it's rising to a new sort of fever pitch right now because, your phone can pretty much plot all of your calendar for you and, it knows more about you than you do.
Yeah, it does.
So, right. And so it's your brain. So, the machines, but part of as a key uncertainty, what will be the role and relationship and the nature of the machines that we have around us? That means software as well as, robots cleaning the floor. Their relationship with us and the work that they do and how it's embedded in our daily routines.
No, I didn't mean to interrupt, but this is a huge issue for workforce sports, right? And for education to think about, to understand how automation is impacting the industries that are in their region. This is really a conversation.
And it's interesting how it has risen to such a top of mind issue and how it's sort of crossing domains and sectors. So workforce, absolutely, right? Everybody's talking about we're going to lose our jobs. But in defense and security, right, the future of automation in warfare, and that's a huge topic. In learning and education, it's what the role of them as teachers and data gatherers and adaptive systems, and so it's one of those top of mind issues that is both easy to engage people on because everybody's reading about it now and everybody's sort of experiencing it now. But it's also something that is, I think, from our point of view, fairly uncertain. I think there's a lot of uncertainty about, again, just look at will the machines take our jobs? Huge divide and debate over whether or not, the economy will create, whether this technology will create more new jobs as in the past or whether it won't, right? So that is one of those easy, big uncertainties for people to dive into if they want to get into a big uncertainty first.
So if you were to offer a suggestion for an organization, and again, since we deal a lot with local workforce boards, how do you tell them to start like, I mean, they just don't sit down like with blank butcher paper and
well, I've seen that.
some
but yes.
scented magic markers and start. Like, how do you sit down and start? What are some of the systemic ways that you want to catalog your thinking?
That's a very good question, and a couple of simple things that any workforce board can think about. Seeing the bigger picture and seeing the longer view, right? So those two things, seeing the bigger picture and seeing the longer view, and to start their conversation, to help give it some structure. A little bit of...
What's a longer view when you're sitting with an organization?
So,
I mean, do companies think about 5 years? Because we have plans and everybody says, oh, you got to have a 5-year plan, a 4-year. I mean, do companies think about 5, 10 years out?
Some do. And so this is where it gets very client or very organization specific. There literally are organizations that to them 2 years is that's their strategic horizon. And there are, of course, other organizations that, because of the nature of their investments and all that kind of stuff, they want to talk 10 or 20 years down the road. So it becomes very situation specific. Generally speaking, just as a starting point with organizations, you normally want to at least get them to the 5-year mark. And often you want to get them out to the 10-year mark. From a futures point of view, if their long view is really just the next 12 to 24 months, most of the things like the technologies that are going to be mainstream or become issues of the big public policy issues that are going to hit, they're already fairly well mature at that point, right? They're really sort of close to just popping and becoming the new normal. And so with futures thinking, you are trying to help get them to look farther down the road. And that would be, the seeing farther ahead. The seeing the bigger picture would be a little bit of systems thinking. It would literally, if you think about it, in terms of a map, like map terms, seeing the bigger picture would be pulling back to see a bigger map, right? More of the landscape. And the seeing farther ahead would, of course, be seeing further to the next edge of the map. And so, with organizations, a good place to start is often do a little bit of quote unquote systems thinking, right? So you've got workforce development. What are the pieces of that, right? Locally, what are the pieces of that system? Because we're now all supposed to think in terms of building these systems. So what are the pieces? Who are the players? Literally, how do they connect to each other? And you start to build that picture. And that is a good starting point for then asking, well, what of all the signals of change that people are talking about might be impacting this map line? So it's a more complete picture so that you can detect more things that might be changing.
Just a quick reminder, you're listening to Workforce Central, the official podcast of the National Association of Workforce Boards from Washington, D.C. I'm Ron Painter. My guest today is Dr. Richard Lum. We're talking about scenario planning, futuring. Richard, let me ask you, one of the interesting things I saw in the book or read in the book was you talked about we have to be aware of the speed of change, kind of the isn't it Murphy's law that the what technology or the amount we know doubles. Moore's law.
Yes. Murphy's we also don't.
Yeah, Murphy. We don't want. Yeah, we don't want Murphy's law impacting this. Moore's law. That's something that takes a little bit of thought, isn't it? To like.
There are and we won't get too into the weeds with the technical parts here, but when you get into doing foresight work and you really dig into it, one of the things change at different rates. Human beings, and part of our challenge with doing good futures thinking is that human beings, you and I, are really good at intuitively sort of doing forecasting in terms of linear change, right? Meaning 1 + 1 + 1 + 1. We're good at that, right?
Right.
We're really very good at that. And so when the world acts like that, we have a pretty good handle on things. It becomes a little bit more challenging for us because another type of change they call exponential, right? And so like Moore's law. And so, when things are doubling, when things are tripling, and basically what it means is instead of growing slowly in a straight line across the graph, it starts off really small on the left hand of the graph, and then all of a sudden it just starts to shoot up sideways up the graph, and you go from apparently having very little to having an overwhelming number. And so when you are dealing with periods in which your industry or technologies in society are starting to change at those kinds of rates, we naturally are not that good at it. So, getting back to the, trying to do good futures thinking, it's trying to help folks recognize that there are different things that you're looking at. Things change at different rates. We want to be good at separating those things out, and we want to be good at thinking through, like, what would that mean? Right now, one of the big things you'll find in Foresight, particularly like in the government side, lots of people like to talk about this is like an exponential age, meaning we have all of these technologies like Moore's law that are evolving at an exponential rate. And what they're saying, that is for shorthand, is there's going to be some crazy cool stuff much sooner than you think. More things are going to be really different than you think, sooner than you think. So don't think that you know what things are going to look like, because that much change is potentially going to happen like in the next 5, 10, 15 years.
Yeah, this is not a map that you make and hang up on the wall and go.
Exactly.
And that gets me to a point that I wanted to ask you about, because we're really focused on metrics and really focused on outcomes. There's a lot of conversation in that, and literally all of the federal legislation that we're talking about. One of the things that you say in the book is that the metric of success for scenario work is not whether or not you got the future right. It's whether or not they inspired informed action that years later you are happy to have taken. Tell me a little bit more about how you look at success in this work.
So one of the challenges that we have as human beings dealing with the future is that the future does not exist, right? So you can't study it. There's no data you can collect on the future. It hasn't come into being. What we have and what we look at is history, right? And then whether we extrapolate from that or whatever. But the future itself, it's not sitting down on 15th Street. I mean, it's not down there.
Because we impact it, right? As we think about how something's going to change, and we take an action based on what we think, we're impacted.
Exactly.
Right?
So at any one moment when we're thinking into the future, there are many possible futures that could happen. And you, me, and all the other folks in the world interacting are constantly shaping those possibilities. So it is very much that. Now, when it comes to like using scenarios, one of the interesting aspects of doing Foresight work is that you have lots of different professions that are trying to apply their knowledge to help people predict. And of course, we don't predict, but trying to help people predict the future. I mean, we're all trying to use all of this knowledge to get the things that we want to get done in the world. Some approaches to talking and thinking about the future are trying to get it right. So when people are doing probabilistic forecasting, when people are doing statistical forecasting, I think in a very real sense, they are trying very hard, and in some respects, doing really incredible jobs of trying to look at specific things and trying to get that more right? Trying to understand or trying to get better at predicting or anticipating when a government will fall, something like that. But the way that we often will use scenarios, and the very reason why you do scenarios, and for anybody in the audience who isn't familiar, a scenario is simply a story about a possible future. And so when you do scenarios, you're doing 3, 4, 5, 6 scenarios. It is inherently about saying, we're not exactly sure what the future is going to look like. We know there's different possibilities. So we're going to explore what some of those possibilities are. So when it comes back to metrics, one of the things that folks will often ask is, what's your hit rate, right? How often have you gotten this stuff right?
Yeah.
Like it's whenever I get introduced randomly at a meeting or a mixer or whatever, and somebody goes, "Oh, here's Richard. He's an academically trained futurist." Almost inevitably, the person I'm meeting is asking, "Oh, so do you have a great story of a time where you got it right?" And the important thing, the reason why the quote that, the metric of success for good scenario work, good scenario thinking, is about whether or not it got you to do something that you were happy to have done, is that generally speaking, when you're doing scenario work, you are not actually trying to get the future right. You're not doing that. And often what you're doing, if you go back to what does future thinking get us, some of what it's getting us is identifying risks and things ahead of time. Some of what it's doing is trying to help us identify opportunities in new spaces ahead of time. So when we're doing future thinking, we're not necessarily trying to squeeze and get the future right, because frankly, you're always going to be off. In some respects, you're going to be way off because there's things in the world that we're not yet really good at figuring out. They just produce outcomes that we can't predict. But so much of what you're trying to do, and the reason why the metric is important, is to remind yourself that you're doing future thinking, not to try and figure out what's the one future that's going to happen, because like, what's the future of automation in workforce? That's kind of hard to come up with. But you're trying to inform action. You're trying to make the folks that have to make decisions more confident that they've looked at enough stuff, more confident that they have a more complete map of the landscape, and more informed that they have actually now seen many more of the logical possibilities, and that they are now, frankly, not just reactive, not just, blocking and getting ready, but being proactive and now going after those things and trying to shape a future. And so hence I know that was sort of a long-winded.
No. But I mean, so it's almost like Yogi Berra was right. It's deja vu all over again, because if you do this right, you've sort of seen what might happen, right? Because you've identified it as a possibility, and you have an idea as an organization how you're going to respond to that.
Yeah, so on the reactive side, right, it's variation of contingency planning. Many organizations do that. What if this happened? What would we do? What if this happened? What would we do? So there's an element of that when you use scenarios, but there's also, and it's not always used this way because folks are sort of sometimes just sort of panicked about what could go wrong. But the other way of using it is also as a springboard for positive action, right? And it is. It's people use it for new blue sky product development and frankly to go, hey, we never thought of the fact that if this trend keeps going and these emerging issues happen and this new technology actually takes hold, there's going to be this whole new market space that nobody yet has colonized. And so, again, part of what you're trying to do with good future thinking is you're not trying to predict the one future, right? Because we really don't think that there is one future out there. There's many. And so you are trying to, in a sense, arm them, get them confident, and get them informed to start to formulate and go after those better ones that they hadn't identified before.
Richard Lum, always a pleasure to sit down with you. It's great that we're in the same city.
We are in the same city.
In the same time zone. Lots of times we converse across many time zones. It's a pleasure always to have you. Thanks for coming in and joining me.
Thank you very much.
You've been listening to Workforce Central, which is the official podcast of the National Association of Workforce Boards from Washington, D.C. Just a reminder, the opinions expressed are those of our guest and not necessarily the opinion of the National Association of Workforce Boards. For NAWB, I'm Ron Painter. Thanks for joining us, and I hope we talk to you soon.